All right, we can get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's workshop on salary negotiation. My name is Amanda Brown, and I'm a program associate at the Office of Economic Empowerment, here tonight with Dr. Joshua Weiss to talk about salary negotiation. Before we get started, I'm just going to read a brief disclosure, then we'll have the presentation and some time for question and answers and comments at the end. Please feel free throughout the presentation to use the chat, the Q&A function, and we'll respond to questions at the end. This is a Zoom webinar and will be recorded. The recording may be uploaded onto a public website for future use. Please note that the chat record is subject to public record laws and as such is not anonymous, but the Q&A function can be anonymous, just so that you are aware. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and pass it over.
All right. Thank you, Amanda. Let me go ahead and just pull this up quickly here, folks.
Of course.
All right, can everybody see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Let me also just put the chat in the corner there so I have a... Okay, everybody, welcome. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me and to talk a little bit about how to negotiate your salary. Obviously, this is something that is top of mind for lots of people. And so what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to take you through some thoughts about negotiation early on. Why is it that people don't negotiate their salary? And then talk about what are some best practices? How do you really prepare yourself in the right way for these kinds of negotiations? And what are some of the things to think about? There are a few myths floating around about how to really approach a salary negotiation with an employer or a prospective employer. And so we'll get into that and talk our way through those different things. But before we do, let me just ask you a quick question. I'm going to try to make this a little bit interactive as we go, and then try to save a few minutes at the end to answer any questions. But as Amanda said, please feel free to pop your questions in the chat as we go. If I can deal with them in the moment, I will. If I can't, I'll take the time to look at them at the end. In addition to the fact that you should feel free to raise your hand at the end and ask some questions that way. Okay. I won't go into my background too much, but just simply say that I've been teaching leadership negotiation and dealing with conflict for close to 30 years. I also have my own consulting company, get involved in all kinds of interesting, difficult, challenging negotiations, etc. And so that's probably plenty about me. So let me ask you this question. In the chat box, write the first word or two that pop into your head when you hear the word negotiate or negotiation. What is it immediately that comes to mind? So go. Don't think too much, just the first word or two or sentence or something that comes into your head. Okay, I used to say win. Okay, you could still say win. Michelle, how are you? An agreement, okay. Anybody else? Yes, Tina, you can do that. Absolutely. Agreement stakes, okay. Haggling, all right. See if there's one or two more. If not, that's good. Good enough. Okay, coming to an agreement or understanding a collective bargaining agreement or MOU. Okay, good. So there are some things that quickly pop into your head when you hear that word. And the reason I ask is because, you know, I'm trying to get a little bit of a sense of how you view negotiation, because for many people, we tend to view negotiation in a pretty adversarial kind of way, in a win-lose, with a win-lose mindset that we see the other negotiator as our opponent, and we have to try to win, as Michelle shared with us, or even beat them. And that's not my orientation to negotiation, and I'll explain why in a minute. But I'll just say right now that the reality is most of our negotiations are, when I do a lot of teaching and training in companies and organizations, and I ask people, you know, in your negotiations, how many of them are one-off, you know, where you're going to negotiate once for maybe a car or something like that? right? And how many of your negotiations are with the same people over and over again? And usually, the answer is about 90% are with the same people or organizations that you're going to negotiate with on a continual basis. And so that leaves us very few negotiations where they're just going to be one-time encounters. Why that matters and why that's relevant is that how we negotiate with somebody comes into play, right? If I negotiate with you in a manner where I'm obviously trying to achieve my goal, whatever that looks like, but not at your expense. And I'm not trying to beat you up in the process. Actually, what I'm trying to do is understand what it is that you need to get out of this so that you're also able to say yes. That's the sort of essence of effective negotiation. And yet, too often, people come in and they take a very different approach to all of this. If you're going to work somewhere with a prospective employer, if you're going to be negotiating salary, um, you want to get off on a good foot. You want to come into an organization in a good way. And you also want to demonstrate to that employer that they made a good choice as to why they hired you. So those are some things to kind of keep in mind as we do all this. And I'm hoping that I'm beginning to put a little dent in your mindset about what effective negotiation looks like, because there's a lot of myths out there. Most people learn about negotiation from the media and things like that. And most of the time, the media gets it wrong. They're giving us the wrong message about how to do this well. Okay. So here's just a quick idea for you about where we're going. Okay. So why don't people negotiate? And what's the cost of not negotiating? Okay. And really, in many ways, you're here because you know you should, but let me get into the details a little bit more. Okay. Um, I then want to turn the mirror a little bit in on you and say, most people have a tendency to negotiate with themselves. And part of that has to do with how they prepare. And what I want to tell you is that preparation is an essential element of negotiation. And if you're not doing it, you're not going to get what you want. Okay. So that's a reality. But also, the more prepared you are, the less you're going to feel like you need to negotiate with yourself. When we negotiate with ourselves, it's because we're uncertain or we're unclear about what it is that we're really trying to achieve. And we really haven't thought through what are the things that we really need to get out of this particular negotiation. Okay. Then we're going to talk about something called understanding positions and interests. And this turns out to be a really important point for most of us, because most of us stay at what I would call the positional level. Okay. At that point, we'll start zeroing in a little bit more on salary negotiation. And I want to talk to you about what you value. Because too often in negotiation, and in particular in this kind of negotiation, we're really solely focused on our salary and the money that we can make. And yet, when we take a new job, there are other things that matter to us. There are other things that have value. And so I want you to think a little bit about that. I've seen a lot of times when people have gone into job negotiations trying to negotiate their salary, and they've asked for lots of interesting things along the way that they didn't really even think they could. Um, and then we'll get into a couple of tactics when it comes to salary negotiation, first offers, ranges, a few other considerations. And then I'm going to finish with two things. One is an idea called going to the balcony, which is a way of sort of temporarily managing the emotional dimensions of negotiation. And then the last thing I want to highlight is the perceived power differential that you have when you go into this kind of negotiation, and a couple of thoughts and considerations for women and people of color, because there's a dimension there that folks who fall into that category have to deal with, that those of us that don't have to. Okay, so it's important that you realize that. So let me ask you a question. Why is it so important to negotiate? So in the chat, again, briefly, why is it so important that you do this? Like, why are you even here? What's the point? So give me a thought here. Why? Why do you negotiate? Okay, so you could miss opportunities if you don't. Absolutely. What else? your worth, right? So negotiation helps you to achieve what it is that you're worth. And a lot of that, goes back to your own mind and realizing that you are worth this, and no one's going to ask for you. You have to do it yourself. That's the key, right? And that may be the hardest part of all of this, is asking. And particularly for women and people of color, there are stigmas around that. And so it's really important that you learn how to assert effectively for yourself. Okay. All right. So why is it that most people don't negotiate? First of all, as I mentioned, they kind of see negotiation as a win-lose proposition, and that makes them uncomfortable. They don't like that. They don't like the thought of either losing, or there are some people in the world who, really value relationships and they don't want to cause somebody else to lose. And so we have those dimensions that are some of the reasons why people don't do this. Our culture tells us that some of us should not negotiate and should be grateful for what we get. Largely women, largely people of color, right? But we live in a society where that was the story. That is the story that many people still get. And as Tina said, as a minority, I was afraid, right? I was afraid to ask. I was afraid to assert for myself because I might be viewed in a certain way, right? For a white male like me, I'm not going to be viewed that way. I'm going to be viewed as somebody who asserts effectively for themselves. But for women and people of color, not so much, right? We also don't negotiate because we fear conflict. A lot of times people go into negotiation and when things don't go well, um, a conflict arises that's difficult and hard for them. And a lot of people don't like that. It's anxiety producing. And so they don't even want to bother, right? And in fact, we're back to that negotiating with yourself, right? There are a lot of people who talk themselves out of negotiating because they play a story out in their mind, right? So the story is, I'm going to ask for this. The employer's going to say, sorry, we can't do that. I'm going to try to push back a little. They're going to get upset. I'm not going to get the job. I won't even go there, right? So that's kind of how this works. And that may not be the exact story you tell yourself, but it's something like that, right? And so for lots of people, they don't even bother because they'll just talk themselves right out of it. The next point is that a lot of people fear the employer's power. Now, there's no question an employer who has the ability to hire you has power. But here's the thing. So do you. Why are you sitting there? Why are you sitting there? You're sitting there because you bring something to the table. They're interested in hiring you. You have value. But we tend to look at the other side as having all the power and us having none. Now, let me just say that I ran a nonprofit organization for a few years, and I'll tell you a secret. And the secret is, when I found a good employee, I didn't want them to leave because I know what a bad employee looks like. And so they actually had a lot more power than they realized. And they had a lot more ability to say, I'd really be happy if I could get this. And I would probably find ways of doing that because I knew how valuable they were. So power in negotiation is interesting because it's not the same as power elsewhere. The very fact that you're sitting at the table with someone means you have some power. I made a little video. I'm not going to show it now, but it's on YouTube, and you might find it kind of interesting. If you go into YouTube and just put in negotiation and power, you will see an animated video that comes up about power and negotiation and Sir Isaac Newton. And I won't say more. I'll let you go check it out. But a lot of people have found it kind of helpful because what the essence of it is that it breaks power down, helps you to understand there are things you can do in negotiation. Um, and you're not just at the whim of the other. And the last reason we don't negotiate is we don't know how. Most of us have not learned how to do all this. And so we fear we're going to negotiate poorly. And when we do, it becomes even more debilitating, right? We end up getting stuck. We end up saying, that was awful. I'm never doing that again, right? And then you've set yourself back many, many years because you have a bad experience and you're not willing to try it again or learn more. And so those are the main reasons why we don't negotiate and why It really holds us, these things hold us back from getting where we want to go. And the costs of not doing this are real. They're really real, as you can see. So research suggests that 20% of women never negotiate at all. So 1/5 of women won't do it. A woman who, now listen to this, because you have to understand the importance of time and how um, resources compound over time. So a woman who doesn't negotiate her starting salary upon graduation or whatever, her early job, right, will forgo an average of $7,000 in the first year. Okay, you say, well, that would be nice to have, but that's not crazy. But what is crazy is you're going to lose between 650,000 and $1 million over the course of a 45-year career. That's not chump change. That's something to really pay attention to and understand why it's so important. Okay. Now, why should you negotiate? We've talked about why you don't, right? But why should you do this? So first of all, most employers are open to negotiating offers. Really, like they bring you there and they start talking to you and they think you're going to negotiate. So they're open to it. It's the rare occasion where somebody will say, well, I really think I'm worth more than that. And it's based on, these independent standards and things like that. It's very rare that somebody will say, well, yeah, we're not negotiating. It's a take it or leave it scenario. So go into your situations, into these negotiations, understanding that most of these people are open to negotiating offers. And in fact, some employers offer less because they expect to negotiate. They're trying to give themselves a little bit of wiggle room, but they have that ability. Employers also want their applicants to be satisfied with the terms of their offer. I work with a lot of companies and organizations, and they often will say to me, when I bring somebody in, I want them to come in a good way. I want them to come in and be excited about working here. And they're not going to be excited if I nickel and dime them, if I try to push them down to the bottom of what I'm capable of doing. I know that's going to tell them something about how I value them, right? So keep that in mind. You're there and you're also right now in a market that is very favorable to you as a prospective employee, because there's a lot of jobs out there that are not going filled. That gives you leverage, right? So you have to also think about the market. It's not just a real estate market or things like that, but there's also a job market. And when things are as they are right now, it's really important to keep that in mind, that you have that much more value because people can't find people to hire, good people to hire. But only about 25% of applicants negotiate. Both sides can get what they want if they negotiate well. That's the heart of this. And it is very possible. So just remember, if you receive an offer, if you receive even the ability to come in, right, and sit down and talk about something, um, you know, that means they want you in some way, shape, or form. Now, there could be some other people, but um, but it also really means that there's a strong interest in you, and that means that negotiating is perfectly reasonable. As Michelle said, as somebody who has hired before, we make a lower offer expecting a negotiation, right? So keep these things in mind, because as you're seeing, hopefully, there's a lot that goes on in negotiation that happens between your ears. And this is the place where, for many of us, we have to try these kinds of things out. Let me just pause for one quick second and ask, how many of you have actually tried to negotiate a salary? Has anybody out there been successful? And if you haven't tried to negotiate, why don't you? As Tina said, as a minority, I was afraid. What have other folks, what have you learned in doing this? And you can feel free to unmute your line and share a story if you've got one. Or put it in the chat, whatever you like. So total imposter syndrome, haven't negotiated but wanted to. Right. And for those of you who don't know what imposter syndrome it's basically the notion that, excuse me for one second, let me just shut my door. Sorry about that. Imposter syndrome basically means that when you get into a situation, you think you're not worthy. You think that even though you've done all these things to get yourself into that situation, you feel like an imposter. You feel like in the end that you're not worthy. So Matt, you got retaliated on for doing it. Wow, that is rough and that is unusual. And I, in many ways, it'd be good to hear more about that, and maybe we can kind of pull that apart a little bit. But that's I haven't heard too many instances of that. It does, as Matt's saying, it does happen, and yet it's the exception. It's not the rule. So I think, you know, when that kind of thing does happen, it really can have an impact on how you approach future negotiations. And sometimes it's really important to talk to yourself again and say, look, that was one instance. I can't transfer that lesson to another one because it may not at all be relevant. And it's very likely that something like that won't happen again. But that's a conversation you have to have with yourself, right? And that's a difficult one, because those experiences are painful for sure. Okay. So here's the most important rule. A friend of mine at Harvard had this on his door for many years. If you ask and you hear the word no, you feel stupid in the moment. If you don't ask, you feel stupid for the rest of your life. And I think that's really true. And I think it comes down to asserting for yourself and understanding that the answer um, is always going to be no if you don't ask, right? As Michael Jordan used to say, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And so, it's something to keep in mind. And I'm not telling you that you're not going to hear the word no, but I am telling you that if you ask, you'll be surprised that you're certainly not going to hear it all the time. Um, you'll hear it occasionally. And then again, it's interesting too, because when you hear the word no, sometimes people think, okay, negotiation's over. No, 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 hold on a minute. It's not over, because you want to ask and say, well, okay, help me understand why this isn't possible, right? What is it about that is not working for you? Is there another way we can do this? Whatever it might be, right? The best negotiators that I've worked with over the years, they take a problem and they stay with it, and they hit a lot of roadblocks and they try to figure, how am I going to get over this? How can I take a different tact or a different approach to all of this, etc. Okay. So keep this in mind because it really is important. And I think the folks who really take this to heart um, end up succeeding far more than they fail. And by the way, I'm not going to tell you that you're not going to fail in negotiation. In fact, I'm writing a book right now about failure in negotiation and how to not let it debilitate you, how to recognize that this is part of the landscape of negotiation, but how to learn from it and how to come back better and stronger the next time. So stay tuned for that. Um, I think it's really critically important to understand that most people negotiate with themselves. They talk themselves out of things that they want. And as I mentioned before, they create a story in their minds about um, what's happening or what might happen if they were to engage in a particular manner. And I want you to pause there, because what those stories are all based on are assumptions. And it's normal to make assumptions, but to me, assumptions are the silent killers of effective negotiation. Okay. Because what happens is that they start to take over and they start to wreak havoc on what we think is possible without actually knowing and without actually checking with the other side. So I want you to just do your best when you find yourself um, beginning to sort of have your doubts and to say, well, do I really need that? Maybe I could let go of this. Hold it. Just let the other tell you that's not possible. Don't tell yourself that's not possible. Okay. I see it all the time. It really is one of the bigger challenges that people face and in this process. And why I spend lots of time working on the psychological realm with people, because I believe that's where so much of this happens. One of my colleagues who wrote the very famous negotiation book, Getting to Yes, that some of you may have heard about, also wrote a great book called Getting to Yes with Yourself. And the whole point of the book was that sometimes you're your biggest impediment to negotiation success. Okay, so keep that in mind. He wrote a whole book about it. So if we're going to negotiate, how do we do it? Now, here's one challenge that you're going to always have to deal with when it comes to negotiation. And that is that you always work with incomplete information, always. So when I sit down in a negotiation, I know certain things, right? And there's shared knowledge. Myself and the other person or people also know certain things. And the other side that I'm negotiating with knows certain things that I don't know, right? So we have to assume that we don't know everything there is to know in a particular negotiation, okay? So if that's the case, how do we negotiate? How do we go about this process when we don't know everything we need to know? There's a way to do it. And the way to do it is to engage in what I would call preparation or contingency planning and not just trying to develop a plan. Now, most people just want a plan. They want to go from A to B to C to get to D, right? Normal. And as you can see in the top right corner, you've got your guy on the little bike there. He's got smooth sailing to the finish line. That's how we imagine a plan working, right? And what we think a negotiation might look like. So a plan is concrete, right? It has a specific objective. It uses a singular course of action on how to achieve that objective, right? So typically plans sort of have one way of getting where we want to go. Not all, but most. When people are thinking about that, they say, I think I'm going to do these things and that should get me where I want to go. But a plan doesn't really address what happens if people deviate from it. And really importantly, from a negotiation point of view, a plan assumes that the landscape is clear and predictable, right? That there are no unexpecteds. There's nothing uncertain about all of this. So I can just forge ahead and my plan should work. That's not how negotiation works. Negotiation has lots of pitfalls, lots of um, unexpecteds, lots of challenges that arise, lots of changes. So the reality, for example, of negotiation is what you see on the bottom there of your little cartoon. That most negotiations have peaks, valleys, obstacles, seas we have to cross, yada, 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 in order to get where we're going to go. So if that's the case, what do we do with that, right? Well, if we think in a preparation or contingency planning kind of way, we're thinking a little more broad ranging. Okay. So we're thinking big picture. We still have an objective. We still say we want to get to here, but we have a number of different ways that we can go down that way to achieve that objective. Okay. And um, this way of thinking is based on contingencies and enables you to adjust to unforeseen circumstances. So one of the things that I try to teach people about as they learn to negotiate is essentially the importance of having a flexible and an adaptable mindset. Okay. So you can go into a negotiation having done your preparation, but one of the things that you should do is you should assume that lack of information and that the landscape is unpredictable and people are going to say and do things that you didn't really think were part of the negotiation or a dynamic that was involved that you didn't realize. So you have to learn to adapt and you have to learn to um, develop a number of different ways to get to the same end. You know, the analogy that I like to use is chess, like, or other board games, right? When you play a game like that, um, typically you have a bit of a strategy for how you want to win the game, right? But the other person makes moves, and you don't know what they're going to do. So you have to adapt and adjust. So if you're the kind of person who doesn't like to adapt, it's something that you really need to learn and work on and learn to do. Okay. There are ways of doing that, by the way. One great way to learn to adapt is to take improv classes, where you learn to think on your feet and you learn to adapt to different things that come your way. All right. So let's talk a little bit about some questions that would help you to prepare for a salary negotiation. So these are relatively simple and straightforward. I didn't want to give you too many questions, and you can certainly add more to this. But the first is, what do you want and why do you want it? Okay. This is key to any negotiation. And it's amazing to me how many people who go into negotiation are not even clear about what their objective is and why that objective is so important to them, right? So be clear, like, yes, you want this job, you want a certain salary, but why and what are the kinds of things that you're trying to achieve? Is it, you know, just the money, or is it to advance your career? Is it, to develop professionally in different ways? What, right? And also, very importantly, what's the industry standard for whatever position you're going to be negotiating it around? Okay. So there are websites called Glassdoor and others that will tell you, if you're going to go negotiate for a salary, here's the industry standard for your position. Okay. And so if an employer comes to you and says, or a prospective employer, and they offer you a salary that's $20,000 less than what it should be, well, lots of people might say, okay, I'll take it because they don't want to negotiate and they're worried about somebody else getting the job. But it's probably, and actually, best practice to say, well, hang on a second. I did my research about this kind of a position, and it seems to me to be in line. This position is in line with the industry standard, and the industry standard is $20,000 more than what you've offered. Can you help me understand why that's the case? Right? And you can do that in such a way that you're not being offensive. You're not attacking them. You're just inquiring and saying, there's an inconsistency here, and I'd like to understand that, because if I'm going to accept something that maybe is less than I should, I better know why. And more importantly, I'm hoping that I'm going to change the negotiation conversation toward that industry standard. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I also want you to think about why are you unique? What do you bring to the table that you think other people don't, right? And you need to emphasize those things as part of your negotiation, right? That here are the things that you're very comfortable and capable of doing. And you think those things set you apart, okay? And then part of your research has to go to them. This is the classic mistake that most people make in negotiation, which is that they will think through what they need and why, but they don't think about what the other needs and why that might be the case. And I can tell you that if you could find a way to understand what a prospective employer wants, and you can help them do their job better, guess what? That's going to be really attractive to them. So how do you know, and how can you find those things out? There's, of course, the wonderful invention of the internet that gives you access to a tremendous amount of information. It's also really good to do informational interviews if possible. So before your interview, ask if you could come and just, sort of get a better understanding of their organization, how they work, what they need. A really good idea, because then people know you, and it's not the first time that you're sitting down. So that's distinctly possible. And then also, do you happen to know anybody that works there? Or somebody that knows somebody that works there that could give you a little bit of insight into what's important, what's the culture of the organization, things along those lines, right? So you're doing your research and understanding more and more about them so that you can persuade them and influence them and speak their language, right? So, and that's where, what can others tell you about their experience in negotiating with this person or organization. So, for example, if you were to get one of those informational interviews and you're meeting with perhaps somebody who does your job, but not the person who's going to interview, you could say, tell me about this person who I'm going to speak with. Right? What are they like? What's, et cetera. Now, a lot of times as well, people will say, well, we have a policy against that, right? Um, and that's often used as a conversation stopper. It's used as a way of basically saying no without saying no. And so it's worth probing a little bit. You don't want to go too far, but you want to try to understand what's real policy and what's not. Usually, the thing about policy is there's wiggle room and you have to find it. For example, there are a lot of companies that might have a starting salary range, right? Well, what if you're more experienced? They might say, well, we have a policy that we don't start people higher than this amount. Okay. So that poses a problem. Except you could think, well, okay, look, I want to respect your policy, but I do have more experience than most people in this particular realm who might be applying for this job. So would it be possible to give me a one-time bonus when I sign on or something like that? Or could we lay out a raise structure that's a little more aggressive because of that? Right. So you can get creative. In many ways, there are no rules to this, and that's a good thing. It means that you can ask, you can think differently, you can probe and see what's possible. But it requires a little bit of persistence and thinking and asking, etc. Now, when you ask or when you're preparing, one of the things that you really want to do is think, what are the hardest questions that they can ask me, and what am I going to say? Right? Because if you can think of that question, you should be fairly certain that they're going to be able to as well. And this is also something like I enjoy sort of playing this out with my wife or with a colleague or a friend. I'll be like, okay, let's sit down and play this out. And it helps you to kind of get in the mode like you've been there before, you've felt this a little bit, you see this, etc. Okay. So think about the hardest questions and then have somebody ask you about that and maybe, do a little mock interview and see how that goes. And when you respond, if it's not so great, be like, okay, hang on, that didn't come out right. Let me try that again. Right. So you work on not just what you say, but how you want to say it. Michelle said, in my new role, I asked for a higher salary and they said they couldn't go higher, but they could give me a bigger bonus. There you have it, right? So it's that kind of thinking that aids you in these processes and gets you where you want to go or closer to where you want to go. Now, there's a really important distinction between what we would call positions and interests. So positions are, we want to offer you a salary of $50,000. The interests are why they're asking that or they're telling you that. Okay. So many negotiations stay at the level of position. So this comes from, as I mentioned, this book, Getting to Yes. And let me tell you the story, the iconic story from Getting to Yes uh, in the opening scene of the book. Okay. And it's basically so that you understand this concept very simply. So there are two sisters who are arguing over an orange, and one says it's mine, the other says no, it's mine, and they go back and forth, and they can't reach any kind of an agreement. And so ultimately, what happens is they say, okay, well, let's just compromise and split, let's get a knife and cut it down the middle, and we'll each have half the orange. So they do that. And uh, one of the sisters peels the orange, goes over to the trash and throws away the peel and starts eating the fruit. The other sister peels the orange and throws away the fruit and takes the peel and starts grating it to make a cake. Now, had they each asked each other, why do you need the orange? They would have gotten more, right? The one girl she wanted the fruit. She would have had twice as much. And the other girl would have had twice as much of the peel. Now, you might think, okay, that's a trite little example. But here's the thing. This is what effective negotiation is all about. Because when we understand, and think of the iceberg on your screen here, okay? The tip of the iceberg is what people tell you. But again, we're back to that information, right? There's all kinds of things that are going on under the surface. And for those of you who don't know much about icebergs, about 90% of an iceberg is under the surface. And that kind of matches reality, okay? Most of negotiation happens beneath the surface. It happens in a way that people are sitting on this information, and we have to figure out, why do they want that? Why are they asking for that thing? What's so important to them in this situation? And the why comes in two forms, generally speaking, okay? Tangible and intangible. So tangible is budget, money, salary, right? Maybe we have a constraint. Maybe our organization's already over budget for the year. But those are tangible, touchable things, okay? Intangible interests are those things that make us human. If someone is feeling disrespected, if somebody's feeling mistreated, if someone's offered, a lower than reasonable salary, they might feel that the organization doesn't value them, right? That idea is an intangible interest. It's not a tangible one, it's an intangible. Okay. So in our negotiations, we have to think about, what's my position and why? And then your challenge much of the time is to figure out, what's the position and the interest of the other negotiator? Because once you learn that, if I learn that you have a constraint, right? We have a policy, or if I were to pay you more, then I set a precedent. Well, if we go back to Michelle's scenario, well, then we could think maybe a bonus might help us there, right? So when we get down to the underlying interest, we don't solve the negotiation. The problem isn't always clear. But what we do is, we now understand why the other side is doing what they're doing and why they're motivated in a certain way. Okay. So this is a really critical concept, and one that's really important. And when you negotiate for a job and in and around salary, there are other things that matter to you. And that's what we mean when we say value in negotiation, that there are things that you value, right? So let me ask you this, okay? In the chat, tell me this. So negotiation is all about what you value. Do you know what's most important to you? So what I mean by that is, when you sit down to negotiate a new job, for example, salary matters, getting paid in a way that is, appropriate, beneficial, et cetera. But what else matters to you? What else could you ask for as part of that negotiation, that would bring you value, would bring you something of importance? So put some things in the chat box. What are the things that you value that you might ask for as part of this? Okay, so flexibility, hybrid remote balance, right? Work-life balance, work from home, a hybrid environment. Okay. Vacation time. And by the way, work-life balance might also be like flex time, right? That um maybe they offer a 4-day work week if you're willing to do something like that. Vacation time, hybrid, right? Um, Good benefits, challenging opportunities, right? Some people might want professional development. They might want the opportunity to continue to grow and challenge themselves, or take on a new skill, or learn how to be a better leader. There are a lot of companies that provide tuition for people who want to increase their capacity, their knowledge, and their ability to climb the ladder, if you will, right? So my point is, there's lots of things that matter to people in negotiation, and salary is absolutely one of them, and it's important to get what you're worth. But these other things are how you make a good deal a great deal, right? So think about those things, because, you know, employers do have constraints. They do have a bottom line, and yet there are certain things that you can ask for that don't cost them anything, right? They may already have a daycare on their facility, and that could be a big benefit the way daycare is going nowadays, right? So important to think kind of holistically and broadly about all of this. So I know I've got about 13, 14 minutes left here. So let me try to just talk about some of the basics, and hopefully we'll have enough time to get a little bit of a conversation about certain things. So the basics are really that when you're going to sit down, there are 3 points, if you will, that you have to think through. The first is, what's your target point? What would you like to achieve? Okay, that's your target point, is where you ultimately want to land. Your aspirational point is kind of the inflated point to begin distributive negotiation. So if we think that, um, you know, and in most of these kinds of negotiations, people expect they will start higher or lower, and they'll expect to give a little, right? So I think it's reasonable to think that, and you want to think of a point where you should start that's not too high, because if it's too high, it sounds unrealistic, and that might send the wrong signal, right? But high enough that it could land you around your target point. And the third point is a really important one that many of us don't think about, and we don't think through, which is kind of your resistance point, the level that you would not go beyond, and you would consider saying, you know what, it's not really worth it for me to take this position if they're only going to pay me that, right? But what is that? Are you going to take it at any cost? Maybe you've been out of work for a while and you say, you know what, I just need to get back into the workforce. That would be an intangible interest, right? Like I gotta get off my couch and do something meaningful. Those are interests. Those are things you value. And so maybe there's a point at which you might take a little less so you could get back into the game, as people often say. Okay. So think through those 3 basic points. And then there's a couple of things particular to salary negotiations in terms of tactics that are worth discussing briefly. So one of the first ones is, should you make the first offer, right? Um, Now, in a salary negotiation with an employer, usually they're going to be the ones to do that. Um, and that's okay. But there are times when you might want to try to frame the negotiation. You could say, look, I'm not sure where your company is, but I've done my research and looked into the industry standard, and this is the appropriate salary for this position. How does that fit for you? Right? Um, when people say, I always make a first offer or I never make a first offer, you should be worried. Okay. Always and never is not a very good rule in life. Okay. So don't do that. But here's my rule of thumb in general. Okay. Which is, I make a first offer when I feel like I have a pretty good idea of the parameters of the negotiation. Like I have a general sense of what's possible for them and I know what I can do, right? If I don't have that, if I'm not sure and I can't find the information, then I'm likely to wait. And I'll give you a quick example of what I mean. So a couple of years back, my wife had been let go from her job, not at any fault of her own. The university she was working ran into a problem. And anyway, she got this offer of a position and they had to negotiate the salary. And we did our homework, and because it was a private university, we couldn't, the information was not out there in terms of what they would pay. Public universities, they have to put that out there. So we talked about it, and we decided to wait. We kind of knew in our head that her previous salary was this, and if we could get in and around there, that would be good. And so in waiting, we sort of, I was off to the side listening into this conversation. And the person from the university said, well, we'd like to offer you this. And it was about $10,000, $15,000 more than if we had made the first offer, what we were going to ask for. And so in that instance, it was better to wait. And she went back and said, well, if you could do another $5,000 more, that would be really great. I'd feel really good about starting here. And he said, well, we want you to come in a good way. So sure. Right. So in that instance, it made sense to wait, and it was the right move, because had we tried to make that first offer, he probably would have said yes, and we probably would have lost out. And so when you do make a um, first offers serve as an anchor in negotiation. And what that means is that often what happens in your negotiation, so let's imagine that I'm an employer, a prospective employer, right? And I say, okay, we're prepared to offer you $60,000 for this job. So you might then say, well, I was hoping for a little more. How about 65? So you got anchored by that first offer without really even realizing it because you started negotiating from that point forward. If the other side makes the first offer and puts out a number that is not reasonable, my suggestion to you is don't negotiate from there. What you ought to do is do what we call dropping a counter anchor. In other words, you should say, well, my research suggests that it's really this, so I'd like to ask for that. Right? So you don't get anchored by their initial offer. You drop a counter offer if you could, if you will. Now, the other thing I talk to people about is this idea of a range. So if you were to say to a prospective employer, hey, I'd really like between, 75 and $85,000 a year. What do you think they just heard? Of course they heard 75,000. They're only going to focus on that. They're not going to go to 85. They're going to focus on the low end of your range, right? So I'm not a fan of ranges. I don't think they make sense. What I would encourage you to do is actually just put your offer out there. And you should always have a way of justifying why you're asking. You should always have the other side say, you know, or in your mind, you should always be thinking, if the other person asks me why I feel like that's fair or reasonable, I should have a good answer. And a lot of times when people make sort of outrageous offers, if you say, can you help me understand why that's reasonable or why that makes sense because the industry standard is here, they're not going to have an answer. They're hoping you don't ask that question, right? So I'm a big fan of being able to justify your behavior and your actions in negotiation. I think it builds trust and it's realistic too. So, but also, again, think about the salary conversation as about a package of things and not just sort of this single issue. Okay. Now, a couple of other quick things. I know we only have a few minutes. So one of the things that people will often say to me is, if I could just take emotion out of this, negotiation would be easy. And they're absolutely right. And you can't. Human beings are logical and emotional creatures. That's who we are. And when in fact people try to keep their emotions out of negotiation, that's actually when they become problematic and difficult. So our challenge is that emotions will play a role. If you sit down and you're excited about a job opportunity and they offer you $20,000 less than your previous job, like it's going to be realistic for you to feel disappointed and sad and that they don't value you, right? You can't push those things away. Those are going to be part of the negotiation going forward. So one of the small tool and tactic that we use to try to deal with this is called going to the balcony. And the balcony means that when you get triggered, because triggers set off our emotions. If somebody says something to you that is a trigger for you, it causes your emotions to flow, right? So if somebody makes you that offer of 20,000 less than what you should be offered, that's going to trigger in you a feeling of disrespect, right? And you could respond and say, well, how dare you? Or you could say, okay, let me think about that. Let me realize that like I have to manage this. And I know I'm disappointed and maybe even feel a little disrespected, but I'm not going to have it guide me. I'm not going to have it push me in this negotiation down a road I don't want to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause. And I might even ask for a break and say, you know what, can I just take a quick break to think this through, to just, get a coffee or, go to the bathroom or whatever. And that short break is part of going to the balcony. And it provides you just enough space to sort of settle down and say, okay, I know I'm upset, but what's my objective here again? Let me stay focused on that and not let it derail me. Okay, so it's a simple technique. I would encourage you all to invest in and learn about emotional intelligence because that's really where you develop this skill set about managing your emotions and managing them well. Okay. So but in the interim, use this. So if a prospective employer in a salary negotiation comes across as really condescending or whatever it is, go to the balcony. And the balcony can be to remove yourself, or it can also be for a minute just to think in your head about a different situation or a different scenario. We all have places that create a little bit of calm for us. For me, it's the ocean. So I might imagine in my head, okay, just imagine the ocean for 1 second so that I don't say or do something that I'm going to regret, and then come back to the situation um, without having done that. Because it's going to feel good to say something, but it's going to set you back and push you away from what you're trying to achieve in a negotiation. Now, I realize I don't have a ton of time here to talk about considerations for women and people of color. But what I do want to say is that there are certainly uh, things that women and people of color have to think about and consider that men don't. And so there's a great book I would recommend to you called The Shadow Negotiation. And the shadow negotiation is all about that there's two levels of a negotiation. The first is that you might be negotiating salary on the table, right? But under the table, if you will, there's a negotiation happening around the relationship and what that's going to look like. And for women, they're constantly having to deal with that. There are also these cultural considerations in the United States where, if a woman is, trying to be assertive for herself, she may very well be viewed in a way that a man isn't. And so that's the landscape. And in some way, I hate to say there's not much you can do about somebody else's reaction. You don't own that. What you own is being true to yourself and asserting for yourself, right? And if they don't like that on some level, that's for them to deal with, okay? Um, so I'll probably have to sort of leave it there, but I'll just say, there in the last few years, there's a great book written by Sheryl Sandberg about the idea of leaning in. And, you know, it's really valuable that women and people of color do lean in. And as I said, you can't control what the other person thinks about you. What you can control is that you're true to yourself and if you thought through what's really important to you and why, right? And in some instances things won't work out but it's not up to you and it's not about you. And in the other instances, they will work out because you did lean in and you did assert for yourself and you were prepared, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Understand the intent and impact problem. A lot of times people will take an action with a certain intention, and the impact on the other is not what we intended. Think about a time when you tried to be respectful to somebody and they took it as disrespect. That's the kind of thing that we have to be aware of. And so if you do or say something in a negotiation and you see the other person recoil or pull away, it's worth saying, I'm noticing maybe that you took what I had to say in the wrong light. Like, here's what I was trying to get at, right? So clarifying perceptions and intentions is a really valuable thing to do as part of this. And know the distinction between assertiveness and aggressiveness. Assertiveness is standing on your own 2 feet. Aggressiveness is standing on somebody else's toes. And there's a big difference. In negotiation, you have to be assertive, but you cross a line when you're aggressive. Nobody wants to negotiate with an aggressive person. So know the difference and remember that assertiveness is about asking. It's about asking for what's important. And use silence. One of the things that's really interesting is that in our culture, we're very uncomfortable with silence. And I would encourage you to get comfortable with it. Silence is one of your best friends in negotiation. Just sit with it, leave it, let it be, and let the other person work through that. A lot of times we try to rescue somebody from silence and we don't need to. Just let it be and see what happens. I've been amazed actually at how often silence and just sitting with it can change the dynamic in a negotiation. It's not easy, but it's possible. So that's that. I'm happy to stay for a few more minutes if folks have questions or comments. I'm sorry I guess I was a little wordier than I should have been. But any questions or comments about anything that I said that you would like to ask? And if not, and if you have to drop, I totally get it. You have another life to lead here. All right, looks like a number of people have to drop.
Looks like
Um,
somebody raised their hand, so I'm going
oh,
to allow them
please.
to talk for the moment if that's all right.
Yeah, of course. Please.
All right, Tina, you can go ahead.
Hi there. Well, thank you for this session. It's been very helpful. I hope, well, I don't know if it's possible in the future, it'd be nice to have something, have another session similar
Uh-huh.
that focuses on the challenges minorities and women face in terms of mind readiness
Mm,
for negotiation. Because after listening to you today, I've been thinking that there's some emotional preparedness that has to go in. It makes me think about psychological safety,
yep.
um,
Yep.
really being prepared to walk away. Are you really prepared? And
Yeah.
how much that plays a part in it.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're totally right. And maybe I can speak to folks at the state about the possibility of adding that in because I think it'd be great. And to be perfectly honest, I would probably try to find somebody who would be better to represent that than me because I would want somebody who's lived it to be able to share that. And I know plenty of people who could. So well, let's see what we can do. And I appreciate it, Tina. And it's not a small subject at all when it comes to
Mhm.
all this. It frames much of the negotiation. So you're right.
Yeah, yeah. I really appreciate your time and everyone here. Thank you. I got
Sure.
yet another meeting.
Okay. No worries.
So I've got to run, but
Okay. Bye-bye.
thank you very much.
Thank you,
Bye.
Tina.
Thank you.
Okay. So we can leave it there, but I would also just say if my email is out there somewhere, I think. I
I'll
for
share it with everyone for sure.
Yeah, for better or worse, you can find me online. And if you have questions or comments, I'd be happy to answer them. If you don't feel comfortable raising them now, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to respond. So, but thank you everybody for taking the time to join in. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, so much. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. That was very helpful as always. And I appreciate you all for joining today. I will be sending out the recording as well as some resources. So stay tuned for that. Check your emails. And we will be having one more negotiation session in May. I'll send out all the details for that after this as well. So please stay tuned. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night.